Have you ever sat there in silence staring at your phone, asking yourself one painful question? If they really loved me, why didn't they fight for me? Why didn't they try harder? Why didn't they stop you from leaving? Why didn't they say, wait, let's fix this? Instead, they just let it end. No big argument, no desperate effort, just distance, just silence, just gone. And that silence, it speaks louder than any words ever could. It makes you feel like you didn't matter, like the connection wasn't real, like everything you felt was one-sided, because in your mind, love is supposed to fight. Love is supposed to hold on. Love is supposed to say, I'm not losing you that easily. But what happens when the other person doesn't fight at all? That's where confusion begins. That's where overthinking takes over. That's where you start blaming yourself. You replay every moment, every conversation, every mistake. You start wondering, was I too much? Did I push them away? Was I not enough to stay for? And slowly, without realizing it, you turn their silence into your self-doubt. But here's the truth most people never tell you. Not everyone loves the same way you do. Not everyone expresses care through effort and persistence. And not everyone knows how to fight, even if they feel something real. Some people don't walk away because they don't care. They walk away because staying feels harder than leaving. And this is where avoidants come in. Avoidants don't leave like others do. They don't create chaos. They don't explode into arguments. They disappear quietly. At first, it's subtle. A delayed reply, a little less enthusiasm, a little less presence, then slowly they start pulling back. Emotionally, mentally, physically. You feel it, but you can't explain it. And that's what makes it so painful, because there's no clear ending, no final conversation, no closure, just a slow fade. That leaves you questioning everything. And the hardest part? You keep waiting for them to come back, to realize your value, to suddenly wake up and fight for what you had. But they don't, and that silence creates a story in your mind. A dangerous one, a story that says, if they didn't fight, it must not have been real. But what if that's not true? What if the reason they didn't fight has nothing to do with your worth, and everything to do with how they are wired? Because here's something most people don't understand about human psychology. We don't just react to love. We react to what love feels like inside us. For some people, love feels safe. For others, it feels overwhelming. For some, closeness feels like home. For others, it feels like losing control. And avoidants, they experience love in a completely different way. Where you feel connection, they might feel pressure. Where you feel comfort, they might feel suffocated. Where you feel security, they might feel trapped. And this is the part that changes everything. Because if someone experiences closeness as pressure, then fighting for a relationship doesn't feel natural to them. It feels uncomfortable. It feels heavy. It feels like something they need to escape from, not protect. So instead of moving closer when things get hard, they do the opposite. They create distance, not loudly, not dramatically, but silently. And that silence, it's not always a sign of indifference. Sometimes, it's a sign of internal conflict, a battle you cannot see, a struggle they don't know how to explain, because deep down, they might feel something, but at the same time, they don't know how to handle it. So they choose the only thing that feels safe to them, distance. And this is where most people misunderstand everything. You think if they cared, they would fight. But for avoidance, fighting doesn't feel like love. It feels like emotional exposure. It feels like vulnerability. It feels like stepping into something they've spent their whole life avoiding. So instead of fighting for the relationship, they protect themselves from it. And when you don't understand this, you take it personally. You think it's about you, your value, your importance, your worth. But the reality is much deeper than that, because sometimes the person who didn't fight for you was never taught how to fight for anyone at all. And once you start seeing this, once you start understanding this pattern, something inside you begins to shift. The pain starts to make sense. The confusion starts to clear. And the story you've been telling yourself begins to change. Because maybe, just maybe, it was never about you not being worth fighting for. It was about them not knowing how to stay. And in this video, you're going to understand exactly why. You're going to see the hidden patterns behind avoidant behavior. You're going to uncover the real psychological reasons they pull away instead of fighting. And by the end, you won't just feel better, you'll feel free. Now let's go deeper into the first reason. Why would someone feel the urge to step back? Exactly when things start getting serious? It sounds confusing, right? Because for most people, deeper connection means stronger commitment. It means choosing each other again and again. But for an avoidant mind, it feels very different. For them, closeness doesn't always feel comforting. It can feel like something is slowly being taken away. Their space, their independence, their control. And control is everything to them. You have to understand this clearly. Avoidants are not just people who like space. They are people who learned at some point in their life that relying on others is risky. So they built a system where they depend only on themselves, where they don't need anyone to feel okay, where emotions are managed alone, in silence. Now imagine what happens when a relationship starts growing. At first, everything feels easy. There's excitement, curiosity, attraction. Nothing feels heavy. But as time passes, things begin to shift. Expectations start forming. Emotional needs begin to rise. The bond becomes deeper. And that's the moment everything changes inside them. Because now, it's no longer just about enjoying someone's company. Now it feels like responsibility, like emotional investment, like something that could demand more than they are ready to give. And this is where their mind starts sending signals. Not signals of love, but signals of danger. It tells them, you're getting too close. You're losing your freedom. You won't be able to handle this. And even if nothing is actually wrong, they start feeling uncomfortable. You might be showing care, you might be giving attention, you might be building something meaningful, but inside their mind, it starts to feel overwhelming because closeness for them is not neutral. It is intense. It feels like they are slowly being pulled into something they cannot control. And the more real the relationship becomes, the stronger this feeling grows. Now here's the important part. When most people feel something slipping away, they move closer, they try harder, they communicate, they hold on. But avoidants do the opposite. When they feel like they are losing control, they create distance to regain it. Not because they want to hurt you, but because distance makes them feel safe again. Think about it like this. If someone feels like they are drowning, their first instinct is not to hold tighter. It's to push away whatever is overwhelming them, just to breathe. And for avoidance, emotional intensity can feel exactly like that. Too much, too fast, too deep. So instead of leaning in, they slowly start stepping back. They take longer to respond. They become less expressive. They avoid deep conversations. And you feel it. You feel the shift. But you don't understand why. Because from your side, everything was going fine. But from their side, it was becoming too much to handle. And this is where misunderstanding grows. You think they are losing interest. You think they don't care anymore. But in reality, they are trying to protect themselves from a feeling they don't know how to manage. And that feeling is loss of control. Because to them, being emotionally close means depending on someone. And depending on someone means risking disappointment. It means risking pain. It means putting themselves in a position where they can be hurt. And they have spent their entire life avoiding exactly that. So when they sense that risk, they don't fight for the relationship. They fight to stay in control of themselves, even if that means losing something meaningful, even if that means walking away from someone who truly cared. And this is what makes it so difficult to accept, because from the outside, it looks like they didn't even try. But inside, they were dealing with a completely different battle, a battle between connection and self-protection. And in that battle, self-protection usually wins. Not because the relationship had no value, but because fear feels stronger than attachment. Now think about how this impacts their actions. When conflict appears, instead of resolving it, they feel trapped. When emotions rise, instead of expressing them, they shut down. When things require effort, instead of stepping up, they step away. Because every step deeper into the relationship feels like a step away from themselves. and they are not ready to lose that. So they choose the only thing that brings them relief: distance. And that's why they don't fight. Not because the relationship meant nothing, but because fighting would require them to face the very thing they fear the most: letting go of control. And until you understand this, their behavior will always feel confusing. But once you see it clearly, you stop asking, "Why didn't they fight for me?" And you start realizing they were trying to hold on to themselves. And when someone spends years protecting themselves like this, something else begins to form quietly in the background: a pattern, a way of living where emotions are not expressed, but contained, where needs are not shared, but minimized, where connection is not explored, but limited. This doesn't happen overnight. It is built over time, usually starting in early experiences where emotional support was missing, inconsistent, or unsafe, where opening up did not lead to comfort, but to disappointment, where asking for understanding did not bring closeness, but distance. So they adapted. They learned to rely on themselves, to solve their own problems, to keep their inner world private, and slowly, this became their normal. Now imagine growing up like that. Imagine never having a safe space to express how you feel. Imagine never being taught how to communicate emotional needs. What would you do? You would learn to survive on your own. You would stop expecting others to truly understand you. You would become strong, but closed. And this is exactly what happens. Avoidants don't just avoid people, they avoid emotional exposure. Because to them, opening up is unfamiliar. It feels unnatural, even uncomfortable. So when a relationship reaches a point where honest communication is needed, they don't know how to respond. Not because they don't want to fix things, but because they were never shown how. Think about this carefully. Fighting for a relationship is not just about caring. It requires skills, the ability to express feelings clearly, the ability to listen without shutting down, the ability to stay present during difficult moments. These are learned behaviors, and if someone never learned them, they won't suddenly appear when things get hard. Instead, the opposite happens. When tension rises, they freeze. When emotions surface, they retreat inward. When conversations become intense, they disengage. Because their system is not built for emotional confrontation. It is built for emotional avoidance. And this creates a painful cycle. You try to talk, you try to understand, you try to solve the problem, but they go quiet, not responding the way you expect, not meeting you where you are. And that silence feels like rejection. It feels like they are choosing not to fight, like they are giving up. But from their side, it doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like being overwhelmed, like being placed in a situation they don't have the tools to handle. And instead of risking saying the wrong thing or feeling exposed, they choose the safest option they know: withdrawal. Because staying in that moment requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is something they have spent years avoiding. You might be thinking, but if they cared, wouldn't they at least try? Here's the truth. Care alone is not enough when someone lacks emotional skills. They might feel something inside, but they don't know how to translate it into action. They don't know how to say, "I'm struggling, but I want to work through this." They don't know how to stay present when things feel intense. So instead of trying and failing, they avoid the situation completely. Because avoiding feels easier than facing something unfamiliar. And over time, this becomes their default response. Whenever things get complicated, they disconnect. Whenever emotions rise, they shut down. Whenever effort is required to repair something, they move away. Not because the relationship had no meaning, but because they were never equipped to handle emotional repair. And this is what makes it so hard for the other person. Because you are trying to build something together, while they are trying to protect themselves alone. Two completely different approaches, two completely different emotional worlds. And without understanding this, it feels like they simply didn't care enough to stay. But in reality, they didn't know how to stay. There's a big difference, because staying requires openness. It requires effort. It requires stepping into discomfort. And if someone has spent their entire life avoiding discomfort, they won't suddenly embrace it when a relationship demands it. They will do what they have always done: Pull back, create space, return to what feels familiar: independence, distance, control. And this is why they don't fight for the relationship, not because they don't feel anything, but because they don't have the emotional foundation to navigate conflict. So instead of building a bridge, they walk away from the situation entirely. And this leaves you standing there, wondering what just happened. But once you understand this pattern, you begin to see it differently. You stop expecting them to respond in ways they were never taught. You stop interpreting their silence as lack of value. And slowly, you start separating your worth from their limitations. Because sometimes, the person who didn't fight simply didn't know how. And then comes the final piece, the one that explains why they leave even when something real exists. It is not just about control. It is not just about lack of emotional skills. It is about pain. Deep, uncomfortable, overwhelming pain that they are not ready to face. Because staying in a relationship, especially during difficult moments, requires one powerful thing: emotional endurance. The ability to sit with discomfort, the strength to face fear, the courage to remain present when everything inside you wants to escape. But for someone who has trained their mind to avoid emotional intensity, this becomes almost unbearable. You have to understand how their inner world works. When situations become challenging, most people feel stressed, but they stay engaged. They try to fix things. They push through discomfort because the connection matters. But for an avoidant mind, emotional pressure feels magnified. What might feel like a normal disagreement to you can feel like a heavy weight to them. What might feel like a simple conversation can feel like emotional overload. And once that feeling starts building, their system reacts immediately, not with patience, not with openness, but with the urge to escape. Because their brain is wired to associate intense emotions with danger. Not physical danger, but psychological discomfort that feels just as real. So when they sense that discomfort rising, they don't stay and process it. They remove themselves from it. This is where everything becomes clear. Fighting for a relationship means staying in the discomfort long enough to work through it. It means facing the fear of loss, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of getting hurt. But for them, those feelings are too heavy, too unfamiliar, too overwhelming. So instead of working through the pain, they choose to avoid it completely. And what is the fastest way to avoid emotional pain? Disconnection. Because when you disconnect, you don't have to feel as much. You don't have to deal with conflict. You don't have to sit in uncomfortable conversations. You don't have to face your own emotions. You just step away, and everything becomes quiet again. And that quiet feels like relief, even if it comes at the cost of losing someone important. Now think about how powerful that is. Choosing temporary relief over long-term connection. Choosing peace in the moment instead of growth through struggle. This is not because they don't value the relationship. It is because their priority is emotional safety. And to them, emotional safety means avoiding anything that feels overwhelming. Even if that means walking away from something meaningful. This is the hardest truth to accept, because from your perspective, you would rather face the pain than lose the connection. You would rather fight, struggle, and fix things than give up. But they are operating from a completely different mindset. For them, staying feels like stepping into emotional chaos. Leaving feels like restoring balance. So when the relationship reaches a point where effort is required, where emotions become intense, where things are no longer easy, they make a choice, not a conscious, well-thought-out decision, but an instinctive reaction. They step away. And this creates a deep misunderstanding. You see it as a lack of effort, as a lack of care, as a sign that it didn't matter enough. But in reality, it was about what they could handle internally, because not everyone has the same capacity to process emotions. Some people can sit with discomfort and work through it. Others feel consumed by it and need to escape. And avoidants fall into the second category. They are not built to stay in emotional intensity for long periods. So instead of fighting through the storm, they walk away from it. And that's why it feels so sudden. Because while you were preparing to work things out, they were already preparing to leave. Not because they didn't care, but because they reached their limit. A limit you couldn't see. A limit they didn't know how to explain. And once that limit is reached, distance becomes their only solution. This is why they don't chase. This is why they don't argue to keep things alive. This is why they don't hold on the way you expect, because holding on requires staying present in pain. And that is exactly what they avoid the most. So they choose what feels lighter, not better, not stronger, just easier. They let go. And as painful as that feels, there is something important you need to realize. Their decision to leave was not a measurement of your value. It was a reflection of their emotional limits. Because someone who cannot face their own feelings cannot fight for a connection that demands emotional depth. And once you truly understand this, something changes inside you. You stop chasing answers that lead nowhere. You stop questioning your worth based on their actions. And most importantly, you stop expecting someone to give what they were never able to offer. Because in the end, it was never about you not being worth the fight. It was about them choosing escape over emotional struggle. And that understanding is where your freedom begins.